Hey everybody, this is the fourth here. And in this video, I'll be introducing you to clipping and soft clipping mixer effects. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend you watch my sound explained video about clipping, soft clipping, and saturation. Because in that video, I talk more about what actually happens to your waveform while clipping or soft clipping, and how it affects your sound. In this video, I won't be covering that information very much, because I'll be focusing more on the plugins and their parameters. So clipping and soft clipping are both very straightforward effects. Essentially, they just limit and distort your sound at a certain level. As the name suggests, soft clipping causes a softer limiting and a softer distortion effect, with less high frequencies added by the distortion than regular clipping. And regular clipping can also be called hard clipping. Because of the simplicity of clipping and soft clipping, most of these plugins will be very simple and have a limited number of parameters. Let's take the Fruity Soft Clipper for example. You can see that it only has two parameters, threshold and post gain. To demonstrate how the various parameters of clipping and soft clipping plugins work, I will be using the Fruity Wave Shaper. If you use FL Studio, I definitely encourage you to use the Wave Shaper for clipping and soft clipping, because it is super versatile and capable of doing soft clipping in a lot of different ways, which you can adjust to get exactly the type of soft clipping you want. Now keep in mind that not all clipping plugins will have all of these parameters, and some may even have more or possibly use different terms for certain parameters, so it's always best to read the manual for whatever plugin you use if this is the case. But what I cover in this video are what I would expect to be common parameters for clipping plugins, even though not all of them will have all of these parameters. So the first parameter I'll be taking a look at in this video is the threshold. The threshold determines is at what level the clipping or soft clipping starts to affect the sound. It basically works the same way as the threshold on compression effects. Any audio that has a level that exceeds the threshold will be affected by the clipping or soft clipping, and anything below the threshold will not be affected. So I can set the threshold on the Fruity Wave Shaper by right-clicking and making a point. And then to the right of the point, I want to set my distortion curve, which I'll cover a little bit more later. For now, I'm just going to keep it flat. So if I want a higher threshold, I can set this higher. If I want a lower threshold and want to affect more of the sound, I can make it lower. So I'll demonstrate a few different threshold options. So if I put the threshold way up at the top, it's not really going to affect the sound very much. And you'll see in the oscilloscope it looks mostly how it does without the wave shaper on. But as I take that threshold down, you will see it start to affect the waveform a bit more. And it clips off anything that exceeds that threshold. And you can kind of see a lot of these end up being flat at the top with it on. And then if I turn it back off, they're peaking higher. And if I set that to be really low, you'll really start to hear the distortion a lot more. So the next two parameters I'll be showing you are the pre-gain and the post-gain. And these two parameters work with the threshold a little bit. And some clipping plugins might not have a threshold. They might have the pre-gain option with no threshold. And others, like the Fruity Soft Clipper, has a threshold but no pre-gain. So there is some variety on what parameters these clipping effects will have. But basically the pre-gain determines how much the input is going into the 3D wave shaper. And it just changes, it either increases or decreases the level of the input. And so I can get a more distorted sound without changing the threshold by increasing the pre-gain, and I can get a less distorted sound or a less clipped sound by reducing the pre-gain. So I'll just show you that a little bit. And if I reduce the pre-gain enough while leaving the threshold alone, it'll just get a lot more quiet, but the clipping won't be affecting it. And this line here represents the peak input. So this is where the drum loop is peaking at. And you can see that it's below the threshold right now, so it's not actually being affected by the clipping. And you can kind of see this, the transients are really sharp on those drums. But I can increase that pre-gain and you'll see that they will start to be clipped. So you can see that some of the transients are a little bit less sharp. But if I increase that even more, it'll become more and more drastic. You can see that it's really starting to clip those transients now. And you can hear that it's getting pretty loud the more I turn that pre-gain up. And that's why there's usually a post-gain as well. And what the post-gain does is changes the level of the output of the clipping effect. So after the audio signal has been clipped, it'll be at a certain level, and then the post-gain changes that level, leaving the amount of clipping the same. So you can see I just turned it down quite a bit using that, and it's not as loud now. Even though it's being clipped pretty hard. So the pre-gain changes the level of the input, and the post-gain changes the level of the output after the sound has been clipped. And now the next parameter I want to take a look at is a pretty cool one. A lot of clipping effects will allow you to change the hardness of the clipping. And like I said before, harder clipping will produce a more distorted sound. The clipping will be a little bit more audible, and softer clipping will produce a softer distortion sound, and it won't be as harsh or noticeable. So I'm going to set the threshold pretty low to show you the difference between clipping and soft clipping. So you can hear that it's pretty well distorted from this clipping. You should be able to hear that pretty clearly. I might do it a little bit more even. Or I'll just actually increase the pre-gain. Okay, so you should be able to hear that pretty well. So that's how it sounds with hard clipping. And if I want to change it to soft clipping, all I have to do is change the slope of the line after that threshold point. If I put it all the way up, it won't be clipping. And if I start to take it down, it will be clipping a bit more. So basically, the more horizontal your line is after that threshold, the harder the clipping will be. And with the 3D wave shaper, you can even adjust the curve of this line as well, just to get slightly different characters in that clipping. And that's why I really like the Fruity Wave Shaper. You can get a really customized soft clipping type of effect. But yeah, that's the difference. A lot of plugins will allow you to choose between harder clipping and softer clipping. Some will only allow you to choose either between soft clipping and hard clipping, and others will allow you to, have a knob that you can change, so you can set it to be anywhere between like the spectrum of really soft clipping and really hard clipping. So that just depends on the specific effect. But with the Fruity Wave Shaper, you can pretty much do what you want just by adjusting the slope of this line as well as the curve of this line. So that's why I think it's such a great plugin for clipping and soft clipping. And the final parameter I'll take a look at is the mix. This one might not be as common in these plugins, but I'm sure that some probably have it. This is the same as the mix parameter on many other effects. It just determines how much of the original dry signal is going through and how much of the processed clipped signal is going through. So if I have the mix set to 100%, sometimes it'll say 100% wet, then it's only the distorted signal coming through. And if I have it to 0%, sometimes 100% dry or 0% wet, it will have only the original signal coming through. And if I set it somewhere in between, it'll be a balance of the two. So those are the basic parameters that clipping effects may have. Hopefully you understood that and have a decent idea about how these plugins work. When or how you would use them is up to you, as always. I personally tend to use them to increase my available headroom. I'll do some clipping or soft clipping on a sound to prevent it from peaking super high, like this drum loop. You can see if I don't do any clipping, it peaks really high. But if I soft clip that a little bit, I can get those peaks down a decent amount. You just do have to be careful because it can, it does distort the sound. It can cause your sound to sound not as good. But a lot of the time, the change is pretty subtle. It's not very noticeable, and that's why I use it. But in addition to reducing my peaks and increasing my available headroom, I also use them for intentional distortion effects. If I wanted a really distorted drum loop, I could just use the clipping to distort it purposefully. But how exactly you will use them is something you will figure out over time. So hopefully that was helpful. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at clipping in the digital audio workstation.